Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to the February 2022 Reach 3030. As you recall, we have the Reach 3030 every other month, although we have the Tosca ones each month. And I think most of you are on the line on the Tosca one where we talked about Tosca enforcement, which I think someone said, one speaker said, alive and well. That's absolutely true. And we've spoken about Reach enforcement in the past. It's not as aggressive yet as it is on the Tosca, although there are a lot of developments in Reach enforcement that are coming through as well. Today, we're going to talk about various proposals for reform of two parts of Reach: authorizations, which is the A in Reach, and restrictions, which is actually not part of the acronym, because the acronym is registration, evaluation, authorization of chemicals. They left restrictions out of the acronym, but that's actually, pretty active and important part of Reach. Next slide, please. I'm Herbert Stryker. I give all of these in collaboration with my colleague, who's now counsel at Keller and Heckman, Alesh Patel. Next slide, please. And that's Alesh. Next slide, please. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about, various reforms, or a few of the reforms that are envisioned under the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, or CSS. We've presented on CSS in the past. It's a very aggressive program by the Commission to completely revamp the environmental regulation in Europe to ensure, basically, to get rid of problem chemicals and have them replaced or substituted by innocuous chemicals to the extent possible. And that's to, ensure that products are sustainable or produced and used and disposed of in a sustainable way. And that's what the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability is about. It's a very ambitious and aggressive program out of Commission. We're going to talk about two reform initiatives now, authorization restrictions. And we chose this topic because there are now concrete proposals for reform. There were papers that were tabled at the January CARICAL, Competent Authorities for Reach and Classification, and CLP. And there also were stakeholder workshops held in November of 2021. So this is pretty current information. Next slide, please. So what's the Commission up to? Well, one thing is they want to reform the candidate list of substances of very high concern for authorization. Well, it's the candidate list. And I thought I'd give you all a little bit of background on the candidate list before we talk about how they plan to change it. As you probably know, the candidate list is a list of substances of very high concern. There are now 223 entries, chemicals and categories of chemicals that are on the list. I give you a link to the list. As always, the slides in this presentation will be posted on our website, and you could easily find that by, entering the search into Google for Reach 30/30. So what are substances of high concern? Well, they are substances that are carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxicants, substances that are persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemicals, or PBTs, or very persistent, very bioaccumulative chemicals, BPVBs, or substances of equivalent concern. And those are as a growing category, which now includes endocrine disruptors, respiratory sensitizers, substances that are persistent, mobile, toxic chemicals, and substances that are very persistent, very mobile substances. And we've given presentations on endocrine disruptors in the past, as well as presentations on PMTs and BPVM substances. Next slide, please. So if something shows up on the candidate list, it triggers certain regulatory obligations. Again, this is for background for people. If you're European suppliers of substances mixtures that contain candidate list substances, need to update their SDSs to indicate the candidate list status. That's usually done in Section 15 of the safety data sheet. The identification of a substance of very high concern triggers some obligations for importers, producers, and suppliers of articles that contain the substance, usually in excess of 0.1% weight by weight. The two main obligations: notification under Article 7.2 Reach to ECHA and also communication supply chain on Article 33 of REACH. Also, sort of a new development, a new requirement that started in 2021, where if you have articles, either articles or complex articles that contain candidate list substances in excess of 0.1% weight by weight, those articles and a great deal of information about them have to be reported to what's called the SCIP, or Substances of Concern and Products Database. And you may have received, since this is largely an American audience, you may have received requests from your EU customers while they were putting together their SCIP reports last year, in the end of 2020. So also, and most importantly, as the name suggests, because it is, after all, the candidate list of substances of very high concern for authorization, that candidate list substances may be prioritized for inclusion in the Annex 14 authorization list. Next slide, please. So what are the proposals to change the candidate list? One is, this is dovetails to proposals I think we talked about last month, with our initiatives to add to the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation additional categories for endocrine disruptors, for persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemicals, very persistent bioaccumulative chemicals, persistent mobile toxic chemicals, and very persistent, very mobile substances. The proposal is to add those as hazard categories to the CLP. Now, the way this thing works is if something is classified under the CLP as category 1A or 1B, it can automatically be added to the candidate list without a dossier sort of demonstrating that it's a problematic chemical. So the listing of these substances in the CLP is under the harmonized list, Annex 6 of the CLP, basically makes it very, very easy to add those substances to the candidate list. So that's one thing that's going on. So presumably we'll have a very much longer list than we currently have. We have about 233 substances. After you add all these other hazard categories, the list will expand dramatically. So it's envisioned that there'll be an annual notification requirement by manufacturers, importers, and downstream users of these candidate list substances. Well, they'll have to report the uses, tonnage information, exposure, pattern of emissions, information on waste management, and information on possible alternatives. So there'll be there'll be kind of comprehensive reporting requirement for companies that deal with these substances of very high concern. The information will be used to prioritize these substances for further regulatory risk management. It's envisioned that this information will be made public, and that also that the companies will have to pay a fee to the European Chemical Agency for administering this database. And this all dovetails with the idea of trying to get rid of chemicals of concern, problematic chemicals, push European industry towards substitution, and this imposes sort of greater burdens on people that are still dealing with these candidate list substances. You'll have more candidate list substances, more hazards that will result in listing. If you deal with those chemicals, you'll have fairly extensive reporting requirements. You'll have to pay for the privilege to report, and this will all incentivize everyone to basically move away from those chemicals. Next slide, please. So we talked about authorization. What's authorization? I guess just a refresher for people. I don't think we've ever had a REACH 3030 on authorization, but just a refresher, or in case you've never heard of it. Authorization is a fairly unique concept under REACH. There was nothing like it under the former European chemical legislation. There's nothing like it in the US. There's nothing like it in Canada. Korea, which is basically picked up REACH pretty much whole cloth, has an authorization provision. But other than EU and its REACH progeny around the world, it's a fairly unique concept. So what it is, it's a permitting scheme. If you have a substance of very high concern, that's on the Annex 14 authorization list. You basically have to get permission to market and use that substance. And it really sort of, you only get sort of a time limited permission, and it really pushes, it's basically a phase out. It really pushes industry away from those substances, but allows some period of time for them to continue to be on the market, while alternatives are being developed. So it's really a phase out program. On that program, suppliers have to apply for authorization by a certain deadline. There's a mistake on the slide. It's not sunset date. It's 18 months before the sunset date. That's the application deadline typically. And the sunset date is the date at which, if you have not applied for authorization, then you must be off the market. But basically, authorization is a very, very complicated, very costly process. That's why there are some proposals to reform it. And at best, as I mentioned, it's really a phase out, and that you get a limited period of time to continue marketing the substance. Next slide, please. We're also going to talk about reform restrictions. We have talked about restrictions in the past. What are restrictions? Well, they're basically bans of the marketing and use of chemicals that pose unacceptable risk to health and the environment, and where action is community-wide action is necessary. There are currently 70 chemicals and categories of chemicals, so they're very, very broad categories, like PBTs and things of that nature, that are subject to restrictions. It's a very, very important part of REACH. There's a lot of bans. A lot of times, your customers will ask you to fill out a checklist to satisfy them that you don't have any substances in your products that are subject to restrictions. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Alesh.
Thank you, Herb. Next slide, please. So I will speak about the proposal for revision of authorization as presented in the January Caracal document. So there are three options currently envisaged. Option one, to keep the current status quo and just to simplify. Option two, to merge authorization and restriction processes. Option three, remove the authorization title from REACH. The Caracal document mentions the stakeholder workshop where clear majority of views inclined towards options 1 and 2. And actually yesterday I attended a webinar held by a REACH official of the European Commission, and he said that in his view the most likely is option 2. He was quite confident about that. So let's look at these three options into detail. Next slide, please. So option one, keep status quo, just simplify. So how would authorization be simplified? So ECHA would only look at the registrants and downstream user notifications that Herb mentioned previously, and would look at alternatives. So ECHA would not assess any longer hazards and risk of the substance. There would also be no member state committee opinion, which is turned to be redundant. There will be a removal of exemptions for uses for which risks may be controlled. The process would also increase efficiency. There would be some reporting standards for applications with required level of granularity or level of details. And this is really because of experience from upstream applications, where the authorization applications were filed, for example, by importers. And these authorizations covered hundreds of uses that were very often very poorly described. The Commission wants to have more information and more harmonized format of information about uses. They would also want to redefine conditions to grant an authorization, in particular, clear definition of suitability of alternatives. It will probably lead to stricter conditions to grant an authorization with respect to potential alternatives. In case an authorization is refused, the Commission wants to provide for transitional arrangements And here again, reading between the lines, the Commission probably would refuse more often to grant authorizations, because currently, typically the authorizations are granted. So I think here also the Commission wants to be more strict. And they want also to introduce completeness and conformity checks of applications, which is currently not the case. It is the case of restriction applications, but not authorization. It will also lead probably to Commission requesting more complete applications. So this would be simplification, let's say a boost of a bit of authorization process under option 1. How would restriction change under option 1? Next slide, please. So the restrictions would be change with respect to normal restriction according to Article 68.1 REACH. There's the restriction that Herb was talking about. This is a restriction that is based on unacceptability risk assessment by the authorities, that is based on socio-economic analysis. So actually, the normal restrictions, I think there are maybe some 4 or 5 normal restrictions per year, which is not really a high number. So this normal restriction, the change would be that derogations would only be granted for essential uses. Currently, it's a bit, the criteria to grant derogations under current regimes are a bit unclear, a bit random. But from now on, the derogations would only be granted for essential use. And I will mention later what essential use looks like. Next slide, please. But in addition to normal restriction, there is also generic approach to risk assessment. And these are restrictions under Article 68.2. And these are restrictions, these are quasi-automatic restrictions of certain hazard classes, such as currently CMRs. CMRs are automatically included by the Commission into the restriction list, irrespective of risk, irrespective of socioeconomic analysis, just directly. So what the Commission wants to do is to extend this concept not only to CMR and to consumer uses, which is the case right now, but to further hazard classes, endocrine disruptors, PBT, STOT, immunotoxic substances, and possibly PMT, VPVM, the mobile substances, and more importantly, to consumer and professional uses. So this very strict automatic restriction would also apply to professional uses, which would also extend significantly its scope. Again, there would be possibilities for derogation, but for essential uses only. And the Commission also considers that restrictions in articles would focus on articles with exposure to consumers, and textiles have been mentioned specifically. So this was how authorization and restriction would change under option 1. Let's look at option 2. Next slide, please. So option 2 is merger of authorization and restriction. So basically, the authorization list in Annex 14 would be replaced by restrictions. So how would it look like? So normal restrictions, there would be no changes. Again, just essential uses for derogation, as I mentioned. And the biggest change would happen with the generic restriction under 68.2. So the generic restrictions would be divided into 2 separate procedures. First one will be just as I mentioned in the previous slide, the generic restrictions of CMRs, of endocrine disruptors, of PBT, PMT, for consumer and professional uses. So this would be the same as under option 1. But there will be a new category of these type of restrictions for SVHC on the candidate list. In other words, substances from candidate list would not go to Annex 14 authorization list, but would go to the restriction list. if prioritized, of course, not automatically probably, but there would still have to be some step where the SVHC would be prioritized for restriction. So how would this restriction of SVHC look like? Next slide, please. So the document provides that normally these substances on SVHC would be subject to a generic approach to risk assessment. That means, again, automatic restriction without taking into account risk or socioeconomic analysis. But this is subject to sensitivity analysis. So it may be that they would have to go through the normal restriction procedure and risk assessment. But what is important is how derogations would be granted for SVHCs. So the derogations could either be proposed by the authorities, which would be part of the Commission restriction proposal, or there would be joint derogations requested by industry after the adoption of the restriction. And this is actually quite similar to RoHS exemption. RoHS is regulation restricting hazardous substances in electronic products. So the procedure would be that first, the restriction would be published, and there would be some period of time during which industry can request derogations. There will be some latest derogation date. And if the derogation is granted, then it will be applicable generally to everybody. And the Commission says that lessons learned from current upstream applications and RoHS will be considered in implementing such a system. But then there would also be a possibility to ask for individual exemptions that will be applicable only to the applicant, which basically is the same like currently authorizations that also only apply to the applicant. But the Commission also provides that there will be new rules aiming at limiting the number of individual exemptions. So it will probably be more difficult to get one. And again, all these derogations can only be granted for essential uses. Next slide, please. So option 3, replacement. It's actually the deletion of authorization at all. So there will be replacement of authorization by non-REACH processes, either by actions under occupational safety and health legislation or under the Industrial Emissions Directive. Actually, both legislation have the aim of removing risks from the use of the substances and their production, which is quite similar to authorization, but it's of course not that stringent. And there would be also possibility of introducing national authorizations and export bans. But again, as I said, option 3 probably will not go forward. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the derogations for restrictions will probably be granted only for essential use. So, what is the latest development on this concept? So, first, just as a side note, this concept goes beyond REACH. So, this concept will probably be also used in the future in food contact materials legislation, in cosmetics and toys, and probably also in other legislation. Currently, the Commission is using the concept in the Montreal Protocol as a starting point, which takes into account specifically criticality and alternative. We also know from the past that Client Earth, which is a prominent NGO in the EU, opined that luxury, convenience, leisure, cosmetics, toys, or decorative products should not in principle be essential. On the other hand, I know from the Commission, from several their public speeches, that environmental benefits, energy efficiency, climate change benefits, that means Green Deal arguments, will probably be considered for essential uses, at least some of them, or at least partially. So what is the current status? Current status is that the Commission has commissioned external study on the essential uses concept, The publication is overdue already. It should have been published, but it's still pending. But we know that it will be discussed in a workshop that is planned for March 2022. And then after this workshop, there will be follow-up discussions that will take place at the next Caracal meeting, probably in April. So there is a chance that the criteria for defining essential use will be made public in spring. Next slide, please. This is not directly related, but it's also quite recent. ECHA recently published a webinar on assessing groups of chemicals. As we already mentioned previously in our REACH 3030, the Commission wants to use grouping approach for restriction to be more efficient. So now they published that the elements looked at will be hazards, uses. This is quite important. Not only hazards, but also uses and potential for exposure. The main source for grouping will be a registration dossier, and the Commission will always prepare a document on developing their grouping approach. And this document will probably become publicly available. So every report that will mention the overview of the group, the justification, whether or not action is necessary with respect to the group, will become publicly available. Next slide, please. Maybe as a concluding note, during the call yesterday, during the webinar yesterday with the Commission basically introduced the road plan, the restriction road plan that is under preparation by the Commission, and that will be published probably in March this year. So this restriction road plan will include substances or groups of substances that are envisaged for restriction, not only those that are already in the process, that have been already notified in the registries of intention, but also those that are not public yet. And the Commission mentioned that this road plan includes a quite large group of phthalates, of bisphenols, some 30 or 40 substances in it, and also some flame retardants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alesh. So actually, I think one thing that I found rather interesting is that if authorization now would only be granted for essential uses, it's a quite different system than the authorization we currently have. Because I think none of the authorizations that were granted so far were what I would call essential uses, at least as it's defined by the NGOs. So it's really quite a different system. Anyway, join us for our next REACH 3030 on April 13th. Next slide, please. As always, we have an OSHA 3030 on February 16th, and TSCA 3030 will be in March of 23rd. As I mentioned, the TSCA one is every month, the REACH one is every other month. Next slide, please. And I'm Herb, and I'm joined by Alesh. And I hope you enjoyed this program. We had about 100 participants. So everybody have a good rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.